In this lecture, we're going to be talking about Model Rule 1.8a and specifically the comments that the ABA has included with the rule that help flesh it out and explain some of its provisions. This is in a section of the Model Rules of Professional Conduct that deal with special rules for lawyers under conflicts of interest. All of the 1.8 rules relate to the lawyer's personal conflicts of interest or vested interests in dealing with the client. The other conflicts of interest rules focus on conflicts between the lawyer's multiple clients. And so, but these are the, what maybe lay people or outside of the law context, people would think of as a conflict of interest, like your personal investments or dealings or interactions and so forth. And just to remember that you're not allowed, 1.8a is about business transactions or business deals with your client, and you can't enter into a business transaction with a client or acquire an ownership or possessory security or other pecuniary interest that ends up being adverse to a client. In other words, like a partial share of something that they're the primary owner of or something like that, unless you meet these three conditions. And in a previous lecture, we talked about that the terms have to be fair and reasonable. All the terms have to be fully disclosed to the client if you are going to do a business transaction with a client. And the terms all have to be transmitted in writing in a form that the client can understand. No heretofores and wheretofores and things like that. The client also, it has to be advised in writing. You need to prepare a document advising the client that it would be good for them to seek legal counsel, like a second opinion from another lawyer. And you have to give them time. You can't say, okay, the deal's off the table if you don't, at midnight tonight. You have to give them time to make an appointment and go for a consultation with another lawyer. And then the client has to sign a document in writing giving consent to both the terms of the transaction and the lawyer's role, including whether you are trying to represent the client and yourself at the same time in the transaction. We're going to make you own that and put it in writing and have the client read it and sign it. Now, comment 1. The requirements of paragraph A must be met even when the transaction is not closely related to the subject matter of the representation, as when a lawyer is drafting a will for a client and then the client needs money, so that you learn the client needs money for unrelated expenses and offers to make a loan to the client. In other words, we're not just talking about your representation. There's times where you'll be handling a legal matter for a client, and then the client needs money, they need to sell an asset or something like that, and you're like, oh, you know what, I'm in the market for that. So you decide to buy it, lend the money to the client, or do something that isn't even related to your representation. 1.8a still applies. 1.8a applies to lawyers engaged in the sale of goods or services related to the practice of law. And the big examples are title insurance or investment services. Like, let's say you're also a licensed broker or certified financial analyst or something like that. And you provide that to clients in addition to your legal services. Or sometimes tax lawyers are also a CPA, so you're a JD, a CPA and an attorney. The accounting work that you're doing for the client, you need to fill out the paperwork and make the disclosures under 1.8a if you're going to do something else and be their lawyer. This also applies to lawyers purchasing property from estates they represent. Lawyers who draft wills for clients will often find themselves either they'll volunteer or the client will ask if they'll be the executor of the estate when the client passes. And so then what happens is you end up with an estate that has some assets that are really awkward to divide among the heirs. Let's say you have an estate and there's 3 heirs and the decedent owned 2 vehicles. Well, how do you divide 2 vehicles between 3 heirs? And so part of estate management, the executor ends up having to liquidate some of the items in the estate, real estate holdings or vehicles, maybe some pieces of art. And sometimes you as a lawyer, you're the one selling this stuff and you're like, actually, I was in the market for a car just like that. So you can buy it from the estate, but you then have to make all these disclosures and fill out the paperwork and so forth. And you have to make sure that you are paying fair market value. You don't, if you're the executor of the estate, you don't get to give yourself a sweetheart deal on assets that are in the estate when you're liquidating it. Now, here's some things that 1.8 does not apply to. It does not apply to your ordinary fee arrangements between a client and a lawyer. Why? We have a standalone rule, 1.5, that's all about fees and when you're allowed to charge fees, what types of fees, when fee agreements have to be in writing, and so forth. And so 1.5 governs fees, not 1.8a. But here's an important exception. Sometimes the client will want to pay you in property in lieu of fees. And so so that you're helping someone start a business and they don't have, they're cash strapped, they can't pay your legal fees, but they offer you a small ownership share in the business as payment for your fees. In the previous video about 1.8a, I talked about this, and I talked about how that generates a lot of legal malpractice actions when you do that, but it's a common occurrence. I know patent lawyers who, when they're representing inventors, the inventor doesn't have cash to pay the lawyer, so they assign a small percentage of ownership in the patent to the lawyer as payment for their fees. If you are accepting property in lieu of cash for fees, then that property transaction is a 1.8a business transaction. So you have to comply with 1.5 for the overall fee, like how you're being paid. Are you being paid hourly or a flat fee or contingent fee? And then the property received in place of money for your fee is a separate business transaction with a client, and you have to go through the requirements of 1.8a. Also, 1.8a does not apply to standard commercial transactions for goods and services that the client generally markets to others. Example, banking and brokerage services, medical services, products manufactured or distributed by the client, and utility services. If your client owns a hair salon or a barber shop and you go and get your hair done there, that's a nice gesture. Why wouldn't you? It gives you a chance to talk to your client who cuts hair, and you don't have to go up to the register after you get your hair cut and say, I need you to sign all these forms, or with this ream of papers. You are a customer of your client right then, just like any other customer. This isn't really a special deal that they're doing between the client and the lawyer. The risk to a client is greatest when the client expects the lawyer to represent the client in the transaction itself, or when the lawyer's financial interest is great enough that the lawyer has a material limitation. Please note, the lawyer must comply not only with the requirements of 1.8a, but also with the requirements of 1.7. And this is an important point for law students to understand. So we are very likely to run afoul of 1.8a if you are trying to represent the client and be the other party in a transaction at the same time. Hopefully that conflict is obvious to you, but lawyers do this, and we have to have a rule about it. And also keep in mind that when you do a business transaction with a client and you're also representing the client, it can start to create a material limitation. And this has two implications that you need to keep in mind for test questions. Number one, you can comply with all of the technical requirements of 1.8a, let's say, and still be in violation of 1.7, which is conflicts of interest for material limitations of the lawyer. That's 1.7 A2. And so in other words, you've made the disclosures, the deal is fair and reasonable, and you have you have the three documents prepared to give to the client or have the client sign and so forth. And so you've complied with 1.8a, but if the transaction itself is now objectively kind of impairing your judgment or giving you too much skin in the game for your own clients so that it's a material limitation, you're in violation of 1.7 even though you complied with 1.8a. Conversely, you could, if you are violating 1.8a, like you didn't make the disclosures or you didn't give the client some of the notice in writing that you're supposed to, you could also be violating 1.7. The State Bar doesn't have to pick which rule to discipline you for, they can stack them on top of each other. And very often, if we do see someone get disciplined for conflicts of interest, they've violated a number of conflicts of interest rules at once, 1.8 and 1.7. Keep that in mind. Now, if the client is independently represented in the transaction, paragraph A2 of this rule is inapplicable. In other words, if your client already has another lawyer for this transaction, and you that are a lawyer that does other legal work for them, then you don't have to tell your client in writing that they should talk to another lawyer. The other lawyer's already sitting there. And similarly, the requirement for full disclosure will be satisfied either by a written disclosure by the lawyer involved in the transaction or the client's independent counsel. So if they have another lawyer, that person we're going to kind of presume is going over the terms of the agreement and advising them. So we're less worried that you have to put a full disclosure of all the terms of the agreement in writing. And now I want to talk about this for just a moment, but last point about this. If your client already has a lawyer, the fact that the client was independently represented in the transaction is relevant. It's not dispositive, it's not an automatic thing, but it's relevant in determining whether the agreement was fair and reasonable. And so let's say you bought something from the client and you got a pretty good deal. Well, if they're not represented by counsel, we're going to scrutinize the transaction and wonder why you didn't pay the client fair market value. If they have a lawyer, then that's going to go a long way to giving you the benefit of the doubt that the deal was fair, because we can presume that their lawyer would have said, no, this is taking advantage of you, don't do this, or don't agree to this, or they had a lawyer who could help negotiate. We're less worried about them being exploited by you. And so they're selling something to you and giving you a good deal, or you're selling something to them and they're kind of paying a little bit more for you than they would if they got it, they could get it somewhere else cheaper, but they know you. Again, if they don't have a lawyer, we're going to hold that against you. If they do, we might give you the benefit of the doubt. Now, you may be wondering, if you're a law student, why would they already have a lawyer when you're doing this transaction? Well, think about it. First of all, if you represent a corporation and they have an in-house counsel, and what they've been doing is outsourcing litigation work to you, then they already have a lawyer. And let's say you, as a lawyer, you happen to own some land that you would like to, and they're looking for land to develop their business, and you want to sell some of your land to your client who is a corporation. Well, good for you. They already have a lawyer that's their in-house general counsel. Similarly, if it's a client that needs a lot of legal work done, they may have one lawyer that does their transactional work and a different lawyer that does their litigation. Lawyers tend to specialize. And I know there's some solo practitioners that do a little of everything, but a lot of litigators really don't do transactional work, and a lot of transactional lawyers who do, let's say, real estate closings or draft wills don't do litigation. And so your client may have a transactional lawyer and they've been using your services for their litigation because you're a litigator, and now you want to do a deal, so they already have a transactional lawyer. Even within litigation, we have subspecialties. So there's people who, some litigators, that all they really do is pretrial pleadings and discovery. And then if the case actually goes to trial, which most of them don't, they refer you to another lawyer who's the courtroom lawyer, the person who loves charming the jury and objecting to evidence and all the drama and stuff like that. A lot of litigators, you could practice litigation for a long time and never actually do the courtroom drama thing. And so it's even a bigger, starker specialization with appellate lawyers versus trial lawyers. A lot of trial lawyers don't like doing appeals. A lot of appellate lawyers don't like all the stress of doing the trials. And so you could have a case where you had someone on appeal and now the case is being remanded. You're probably going to have a different lawyer for your trial. So just keep that in mind. If the client has different lawyers, then you're probably that's going to cover you for some of the provisions, and then others, you don't have to disclose to them they need a lawyer, and otherwise we might give you the benefit of the doubt that the deal was fair and reasonable, and so forth. Now, loans between lawyers and clients are among the most common, and I'm just going to come out and say probably the most common situations in which Rule 1.8 is applied. And Sometimes this is lawyers lending the client money, as it said in comment 1. It seems like more often this is lawyers who are struggling, borrowing money from clients who have just had a windfall. So you represent someone, a plaintiff, and they win a huge verdict, so they're suddenly swimming in money, and they're like, wow, what do I do with the millions of dollars I just won? And you, as the lawyer who can't quite meet your overhead, say, hey, I know somebody who you could maybe make a loan to. Or you have a client and they've just inherited a huge amount of money, and again, you have lawyers who are having trouble making ends meet. Their practice isn't going that well, so they basically borrow money from the client. And this ends up happening kind of a lot, and I hope you can see the ways that this is going to taint the client-lawyer relationship. And I have a few cases just as quick examples. You don't have to know the case names, they're just for purposes of illustration. In In re Timponi from 2004 in Illinois, after representing a client in a divorce and the sale of the marital residence, the lawyer borrowed money from the proceeds. So some people walk away from their divorce with a lot of money on hand that they were paid out in the divorce settlement, and then the lawyer will say, can I borrow money? Or we have In re Wilty from Louisiana. A lawyer solicited a loan from a client who was receiving a personal injury award. Other common situations are sales and investment transactions that unfairly favor the lawyer, or for which the lawyer has not provided the required disclosure. And there's a case, for example, here in Ray Davis from Indiana in 2001, a lawyer who persuaded a client to invest his settlement funds. The client received a settlement in the lawyer's business ventures. And so, as you can see, this is the lawyers. We're worried that the lawyers are exploiting their clients and taking advantage of them. Here's another example in Re Lupo from Massachusetts in 2006. A lawyer purchased real estate from an elderly aunt for substantially less than the fair market value. And so, again, they were worried about exploitation of vulnerable people. Now, fees paid in property, we mentioned that earlier in this lecture, instead of money, often have the essential qualities of a business transaction with a client. And so here's an example from Missouri in 2000, accepting a quitclaim for real estate interest in lieu of cash, of a cash fee, violated the rule. Now, you can accept property in lieu of fees, but what do you have to do? Go back to 1.8a, and go through those 3 steps. So 1, 2, 3 requirements. Each one requires documentation and disclosures and so forth. And if you skip those, then you could be subject to discipline. Here's another kind of funny example from Washington, 2002. Oops, 2 dropped out there. In lieu of a fee, which the lawyer had estimated at between $10,000 and $30,000, the lawyer accepted the client's mobile home, but promptly resold it for $42,000. And the transaction was obviously unfair and unreasonable within the meaning of 1.8a. And think about it for a second. The first problem here is, how could you not know if the client owes you $10,000 or 3 times that, right? That's a pretty big range. It's one thing if you're like, oh, you owed me 10 or 12, but X or 3X, that's kind of a lot. And then it's presumptively an unfair deal if the client gives you property in lieu of the fee, and then you can turn right around and sell that property for a lot more. Obviously, the fair market value was much higher. We took advantage of the client here. Okay, here's our attendance quiz question that you can either, if you need to document your attendance and you're one of my students, you can email me the answer, or that's actually not completely necessary. Just keep it for your own records, and if you ever need to document that you watch the video for attendance purposes because a question arises, then you have it on hand and can tell me. Which type of transaction between lawyers and clients is especially common according to this lecture? A, marriage contracts and prenup agreements. B, leases of office space. C, loans, especially from clients to lawyers. Or D, real estate sales. Okay, that concludes our lecture for 1.8a comments. We have one more short lecture to do about this regarding an ABA ethics opinion.